Have you ever said nothing? Not because you had nothing to say, not because the words were unavailable or the thoughts were unformed, but because you understood with a clarity that arrived not through deliberation but through the specific, immediate bodily knowing that genuine social intelligence sometimes produces, that saying nothing was the most powerful thing you could do. Not the silence of defeat, not the silence of someone who has been overwhelmed by a situation larger than their capacity to respond to it. The silence of someone who has perceived, in the specific dynamics of the specific situation they are in, that the person or the system attempting to control them has, in the attempt itself, revealed a specific vulnerability, that the demand for a response, for engagement, for the specific form of emotional or verbal or behavioral reaction that the control attempt requires in order to succeed is not a position of strength, it is a position of need. And that the silence, the deliberate, clear-eyed, genuinely chosen withholding of the response that the need requires, is not the absence of power, but its most precise and most unsettling expression. If that experience is familiar to you, you have discovered something that Yuval Noah Harari's analysis of human psychology, evolutionary biology, and the mechanics of social power reveals to be among the most consistently misunderstood and most consistently undervalued dimensions of genuine human agency. The specific power of silence. Not silence as passivity. Not silence as the default of the person who lacks the capacity or the courage to respond. The deliberate, chosen, sustained silence of someone who understands with sufficient clarity about the actual mechanics of the social situation they are in that silence is not the absence of a move, but the most devastating move available. And the specific devastation it delivers is not to the person being silenced, it is to the person attempting to control. Because the person attempting to control, in the full range of the forms that the attempt to control another human being takes across the spectrum from the intimate to the political, requires something from the person they are attempting to control that they cannot provide for themselves. They require a response, an engagement, a specific form of reaction that confirms in the social dynamics of the situation that the control attempt is functioning, that the controlled person is responding to the controlling person's agenda rather than their own, that the frame, the emotional register, the definition of what the interaction is about and what the appropriate responses to it are, has been successfully established by the controlling party rather than by the person the controlling party is attempting to control. Silence denies them this, not partially, completely. Silence is the specific response to the control attempt that the control attempt cannot process, that it cannot incorporate into its own logic, that it cannot use, redirect, reframe, or weaponize. Because silence provides nothing to work with, nothing to reframe, nothing to use as evidence of the controlled person's engagement with the controller's agenda. Nothing that confirms in the social dynamics of the situation that the control attempt has found its target and is producing the effects it was designed to produce. This is Harari's starting point, and it is worth staying with for a moment before moving into the historical and evolutionary analysis that gives it its full depth. The claim is not that silence is always the appropriate response to the attempt to control. It is not that silence is a universal strategy applicable across all situations in which power dynamics are at play. It is something more specific and more powerful than either of those formulations. The claim is that silence, in the specific situations where control attempts are most active and most invested in producing a particular response, is not merely an option among others. It is the option that addresses the control attempt at the level of its most fundamental requirement. The requirement for engagement. The requirement for the acknowledgement, however indirect or however hostile, that the controller's agenda is the agenda that the interaction is organized around. The requirement that the controlled person locate themselves in their response within the frame that the controlling party has constructed. Silence refuses the frame entirely, and the refusal of the frame is, in the specific mechanics of the control attempt, the one thing that the control attempt has no prepared response to, Because every strategy of control, across the full range of the forms it takes, is designed for engagement. It is designed for resistance even. Resistance is still engagement. Hostility is still engagement. Argument and counter-argument are still engagement. All of these responses locate the responding person within the frame of the control attempt, confirm that the frame has been accepted as the relevant frame, and provide the controlling party with the material they need to continue the attempt. Silence provides none of this. Silence is the exit from the frame that leaves the frame standing, unsupported, in the space between the two parties without the engagement it requires to function. Yuval Noah Harari has analyzed the mechanics of social control across the entire span of human history, from the small-scale interpersonal dynamics of ancestral social groups to the large-scale institutional and technological systems of the contemporary world. And across this full span, one pattern recurs with the consistency that reveals it to be not a cultural artifact or a historically specific feature of particular social arrangements, but a structural property of the mechanics of control itself. The pattern in which the most effective forms of control are not the forms that prevent response, but the forms that require it. Not the forms that silence the controlled person, but the forms that mobilize them, that keep them engaged, reacting, arguing, defending, justifying, explaining, and in every case confirming, through the very activity of their engagement, that the controlling party's agenda is the agenda that the situation is organized around. To understand why this pattern is structural, why it is not a contingent feature of specific cultures or specific historical moments, but a feature of the mechanics of control itself, requires understanding something about the relationship between attention and power that Harari's analysis consistently illuminates. Attention is not simply a cognitive resource. In the social dynamics of human interaction, attention is the primary medium of social confirmation, the thing that confirms, in the social reality of a given situation, that what is being attended to is real, significant, and worth the organization of one's response. The thing that confirms that the frame within which the attention is being organized is the relevant frame. The thing that confirms in the most fundamental possible way that the person or the system demanding the attention has the standing to demand it. Control requires this confirmation, not because controllers are philosophically interested in epistemological questions about the nature of social reality, but because the social reality of a control relationship, like all social realities, is constituted by the behavior of the parties within it. It exists as a social fact to the extent that both parties behave as if it exists. And the controlled party's engagement with the control attempt is the primary behavior through which the social fact of the control relationship is continuously constituted and reconstituted. Remove the engagement, and the social fact of the control relationship begins to dissolve. Not because the controlling party has lost the resources or the intentions that motivated the control attempt, but because the social reality of the control relationship, like all social realities, cannot sustain itself through the behavior of one party alone. It requires the participation of both. This is the specific vulnerability that silence exposes in the people who attempt to use control. The vulnerability of needing the controlled person's participation in the construction of the social reality of the control relationship. The vulnerability of a position that is not self-sustaining. That requires, for its continued existence as a social fact, the continued engagement of the person it is directed at. And that begins to lose its social reality, to become less and less the situation that both parties are in, the more completely and the more consistently that engagement is withheld. To understand the historical dimensions of this dynamic requires going back, as Harari always insists, to the conditions within which the basic mechanics of human social control were established. Not to the contemporary forms that control takes, which are specific to the specific technologies and the specific social arrangements of the present moment. To the ancestral conditions within which the emotional and psychological architecture that makes human beings susceptible to control in the first place was assembled, and within which the specific mechanics of social control that remain operative in their fundamental structure across all subsequent forms of human social organization were first developed. The ancestral social group within which human psychology was formed was, as Harari has described extensively across his historical work, a social unit of extraordinary intensity and extraordinary interdependence. A group of approximately 150 individuals bound together by the requirements of survival in an environment that neither individual nor subgroup could survive without the collective's support. In this context, the social mechanisms through which the group maintained its coherence, managed its internal conflicts, organized its collective efforts, and ensured the compliance of its members with the behavioral norms that collective functioning required were mechanisms of existential importance. The group that failed to maintain sufficient behavioral coordination among its members was a group that failed to survive. The individual who failed to maintain sufficient social standing within the group was an individual whose access to the group's collective resources was jeopardized in ways that, in the ancestral environment, translated directly into survival risk. This is the context within which the specific emotional vulnerabilities that make human beings susceptible to social control evolved: the anxiety about social standing, the acute sensitivity to signs of social approval and disapproval, the powerful motivation to engage with, respond to, and address the assessments that other group members were making of one's behavior and one's character, the deep discomfort of being ignored, dismissed, or excluded from the social attention that constituted, in the small group context of the ancestral environment, a form of social recognition that was directly connected to the maintenance of the social standing that survival required. These vulnerabilities were not design flaws. They were adaptive features of a social psychology calibrated for the specific requirements of small group survival in conditions where social standing was directly connected to access to survival resources. The individual who was acutely sensitive to social disapproval was more motivated to maintain the behavioral norms whose maintenance the group required. The individual who found social exclusion genuinely threatening was more motivated to seek reconciliation with the group after behavioral violations that had damaged their social standing. The individual who found the social attention of their group deeply rewarding was more motivated to maintain the behaviors that earned that attention and more responsive to the social signals that their group was sending about the adequacy of their current behavior. These adaptive features are the evolutionary foundation of the specific vulnerabilities that the mechanics of social control have always exploited: the exploitability of the anxiety about social standing, the exploitability of the sensitivity to disapproval, and the powerful motivation to address it, the exploitability of the deep discomfort of social exclusion, and the powerful motivation to seek the inclusion that its relief requires, the exploitability of the need for social engagement and the specific distress that the absence of that engagement, the silence, the ignoring, the absence of the social attention that confirms social standing, consistently produces. These vulnerabilities are the mechanism through which most interpersonal control operates, not through physical force, not through explicit threats, but through the mobilization of these ancient, deeply embedded, genuinely powerful anxieties about social standing and social belonging, through the specific deployment of disapproval, exclusion, and the withholding of social recognition in ways that activate the evolutionary machinery of social anxiety and produce the behavioral compliance that the controlling party requires. And this is why silence, deployed by the person who is the target of the control attempt rather than by the controller, is so specifically and so profoundly disruptive to the mechanics of the control. Because the controlling party's use of disapproval, exclusion, and the withholding of social recognition as tools of control works only if the person being controlled is susceptible to those specific forms of social pressure. Only if the evolutionary anxiety about social standing and social belonging that those forms of pressure are designed to activate is activated by them, producing the specific emotional responses and the specific behavioral compliance that the control attempt requires. The person who has developed sufficient clarity about the mechanics of the social situation they are in and sufficient command of their own response to the evolutionary anxieties that those mechanics are designed to trigger to maintain genuine silence in response to the control attempt is a person who has, in the specific mechanics of the situation, stepped outside the evolutionary vulnerability that the control attempt was designed to exploit. This is what Harari means at the deepest level when he identifies silence as the specific response that destroys the capacity of people who try to control you. Not silence as a tactic deployed in a single interaction. Silence as the expression of a specific quality of self-possession, a specific quality of freedom from the evolutionary vulnerabilities that control attempts are designed to activate. A specific quality of understanding of the actual mechanics of the social situation that allows the person who possesses it to see the control attempt for what it is, from the outside of the evolutionary response that the control attempt is designed to produce, and to choose from that outside position a response that the control attempt cannot incorporate into its own logic. The historical manifestations of this dynamic are numerous and consistent across the full diversity of human social organization. Harari's historical analysis provides the framework for understanding why they are so consistent, because the consistency reveals the structural character of the dynamic rather than its contingent manifestation in any specific cultural or historical context. Consider the dynamic in the context of political authority. The exercise of political authority across the full span of human political history has been organized around the requirement for acknowledgement, for the specific forms of behavioral engagement that confirm, in the social reality of the political relationship, that the authority's claim to obedience is the relevant framework within which the subject's behavior is being organized. The subjects who openly resist the authority are still engaging with the authority's framework. Their resistance confirms the authority's standing as the entity whose demands are significant enough to organize a response around, even if the response is opposition. The subjects who argue with the authority are still engaging. The subjects who complain, petition, negotiate, and plead are still engaging. All of these responses, however adversarial in their surface character, locate the responding person within the frame of the authority's claim and provide the authority with the engagement it requires to continue functioning as authority. The subjects who simply do not comply, who go about their lives as if the authority's claims were not the organizing framework of those lives, who neither resist nor comply but simply proceed as if the authority's agenda were not the relevant agenda, present a different kind of challenge. The challenge that the mechanics of authority are least equipped to address. Because the non-compliance without resistance, the proceeding without acknowledgement, the absence of the specific engagement that the authority's claim requires for its functioning as a social fact is not a challenge that the authority can process through the mechanisms it has developed for managing resistance. Resistance can be punished. Argument can be countered. Opposition can be characterized as disloyalty and managed accordingly. But the proceeding as if the authority were not there, the specific quality of engaged non-engagement that is neither compliance nor resistance but something more fundamental than either, the withdrawal of the acknowledgement that the authority requires for its continued functioning as a social fact, is something that the mechanics of authority, organized as they are for the management of engagement, are structurally unprepared to address. This is the dynamic that Harari finds replicated across the full diversity of its specific historical and cultural manifestations in every domain of human social organization where control has been established and maintained through the requirement for engagement. The interpersonal relationship in which one party exercises control over the other through the mobilization of the controlled party's evolutionary anxieties about belonging, approval, and social standing. The organizational culture in which the norms of the organization exercise control over its members through the mobilization of the members' anxieties about professional standing and professional belonging. The political system that exercises control over its subjects through the mobilization of the subjects' anxieties about social legitimacy and social inclusion. The information environment that exercises control over the attention and the beliefs of its users through the mobilization of the user's anxieties about social relevance and social connection. In each of these cases, the control is organized around the requirement for engagement. And in each of these cases, the specific quality of silence that withdraws the engagement entirely is the specific response that the control mechanism is least equipped to process. The most intimate domain in which this dynamic operates, and the one that most people encounter most directly and most personally, is the domain of interpersonal relationship. The specific ways in which one person in a relationship exercises control over another through the mechanics of social pressure that the evolutionary vulnerabilities of the controlled person make available. And the specific ways in which silence, in this context, is not merely an alternative to the responses that the control mechanism is designed to process, but the specific response that addresses the control mechanism at the level of its most fundamental requirement. The interpersonal control attempt typically operates through one of several specific mechanisms, each of which is a specific exploitation of the evolutionary vulnerabilities that the ancestral social environment produced in the human psychological architecture. The mechanism of emotional escalation. The deployment of intense emotional expression, anger, distress, outrage, hurt, in ways that activate the controlled person's evolved response to signs of social distress in their close social environment. The mechanism of social judgment. The expression of explicit or implicit assessments of the controlled person's character, worth, or standing that activate the evolved sensitivity to social evaluation that the ancestral requirement for social standing produced. The mechanism of exclusion threat. The explicit or implicit suggestion that the controlled person's failure to comply with the controlling party's requirements will result in the withdrawal of the social belonging that the evolutionary architecture registers as a survival-relevant concern. Each of these mechanisms works because it activates something real. The response that the evolved emotional architecture generates in response to signs of distress in close social contacts is real. The response that the evolved sensitivity to social evaluation generates in response to explicit or implicit judgments of one's worth is real. The response that the evolved anxiety about belonging generates in response to threats of exclusion is real. These are not invented vulnerabilities. They are genuine, deep, powerful responses produced by a genuine evolutionary architecture that was calibrated for conditions in which these responses were genuinely adaptive. The control attempt exploits these genuine responses. It deploys the specific triggers, the emotional escalation, the social judgment, the exclusion threat that the evolved architecture responds to in the service of producing the specific behavioral compliance that the controlling party requires. And the exploitation works to the degree that it works because the evolved architecture is producing its genuine response to the genuine trigger, regardless of the actual social circumstances of the situation. The anxiety produced by the threat of exclusion from a relationship with a person who is using that threat to control the controlled person's behavior is genuine anxiety, produced by the same evolved mechanism that produced genuine anxiety in the ancestral context where exclusion from the group was a genuine survival risk. The fact that the contemporary relationship is not an ancestral survival group and that the exclusion threat is not a survival risk of the kind that the evolved mechanism was calibrated for does not prevent the evolved mechanism from generating the response. The mechanism does not evaluate the context, it responds to the trigger. Silence, in this context, is the specific response that addresses the control mechanism not at the level of managing the response it generates, but at the level of changing the relationship between the trigger and the response. Not by eliminating the evolved response, which is not possible through a simple act of will, but by creating the specific quality of space between the trigger and the response within which genuine choice, rather than automatic reaction, becomes available. The space in which the escalating emotional expression of the controlling party is seen as the trigger it is, rather than experienced as the genuine social distress that the evolved mechanism treats it as. The space in which the social judgment of the controlling party is seen as the deployment of a control mechanism, rather than experienced as the genuine social evaluation that the evolved sensitivity to social assessment responds to. The space in which the exclusion threat is seen as the threat it is, rather than experienced as the genuine survival-relevant exclusion that the evolved anxiety about belonging was calibrated for. This space is not achieved automatically. It is not the product of a simple decision to not care what the controlling party does. The evolved responses are real and powerful, and the attempt to simply override them through an act of will is typically unsuccessful, because the will is operating within the evolved architecture that is simultaneously generating the response that the will is attempting to override. The space is achieved through something more patient and more demanding. Through the specific quality of self-observation, of genuine attention to one's own internal processes in the moment of the control attempt's activation that allows the evolved response to be noticed as an evolved response rather than acted upon as if it were an accurate assessment of the actual social situation. Harari's consistent emphasis on the contemplative practices that develop this quality of self-observation is directly relevant here. The capacity to notice the evolved response without immediately enacting it, to feel the anxiety that the exclusion threat activates without immediately taking the behavioral action that the anxiety motivates, to experience the discomfort of the social judgment without immediately mobilizing the defensive response that the discomfort is designed to produce, is precisely the capacity that the maintenance of genuine silence in response to control attempts requires. It is the capacity that separates the person who can choose not to respond from the person who is determined by the automatic operation of the evolved architecture to respond in exactly the way that the control mechanism was designed to produce. This capacity is what Harari identifies in various contexts and with various specific emphases as the foundation of genuine freedom in the social domain. The freedom not from the social world and its requirements, not from the genuine relationships and the genuine obligations that genuine social engagement produces, but freedom from the specific forms of control that operate through the exploitation of evolutionary vulnerabilities that the person who has developed this capacity is no longer automatically susceptible to. The freedom of the person who can see the control attempt for what it is, from the specific quality of distance that genuine self-observation provides, and who can choose from that position of seeing the response that the situation actually warrants rather than the response that the control mechanism was designed to produce. The organizational dimension of this dynamic is the one that most people encounter most consistently in the domain of their professional lives. The specific ways in which organizational cultures, management practices, and professional social norms exercise control over the behavior of the people within them through mechanisms that operate through the same evolutionary vulnerabilities that interpersonal control mechanisms exploit, simply deployed at a different scale and through different social instruments. The organizational control mechanism operates primarily through the management of professional standing, through the continuous ambient signaling of approval and disapproval, inclusion and exclusion, recognition and its withholding, that the culture of most organizations generates as the primary medium through which members' behavior is managed toward the outcomes the organization requires. The employee who is performing well receives the signals of recognition and inclusion that activate the evolved reward system for social standing and motivate the continuation of the performing behavior. The employee whose behavior deviates from the organization's requirements receives the signals of disapproval and the implicit or explicit threat of exclusion from the professional community that activate the evolved anxiety about social standing and motivate the correction of the deviating behavior. This is not a cynical description of organizational life, it is a structurally accurate one. The primary mechanisms through which organizations manage the behavior of their members are mechanisms that operate through the evolutionary vulnerabilities of the human social architecture, through the management of social standing, social recognition, and social belonging within the professional community that the organization constitutes. And these mechanisms work to the degree that they work because the evolved architecture that they exploit is genuinely producing the responses that the mechanisms are designed to produce. The silence in this context is the specific quality of relationship with one's own professional standing that is not organized around the anxiety about that standing. The quality of professional engagement that is not primarily motivated by the fear of the withdrawal of the organization's recognition, because the person who possesses it has developed sufficient clarity about the distinction between the organization's assessment of their value and their actual value to maintain the specific quality of self-possession that the anxiety about standing consistently undermines. The quality that allows the person to disagree with the organization's direction without the specific terror of exclusion that the organization's management of social standing is designed to produce in those who consider disagreement. The quality that allows the person to make decisions based on their genuine assessment of what the situation warrants rather than on the calculation of what will produce the organization's approval. This quality is not indifference. The person who has developed it is not indifferent to the outcomes of their professional life or to the assessments of the people whose judgments affect those outcomes. They simply have a different relationship to those assessments, a relationship in which the assessments are taken seriously as information about the social reality of the professional context rather than being automatically determinative of behavior through the activation of the evolutionary anxiety that the assessments are designed to trigger. a relationship in which professionals silence the specific withholding of the anxious engagement that the organization's management of social standing is designed to produce, is available as a genuine choice rather than as an impossibility that the evolutionary architecture prevents from being genuinely chosen. Harari's analysis of the political dimension of this dynamic is perhaps its most important application, because the political dimension is the one in which the stakes of the exploitation of evolutionary vulnerabilities are most consequential at the scale of entire societies rather than individual relationships or individual careers. The political history of the human species is, in significant part, a history of the specific ways in which political systems have organized the exploitation of the evolved social vulnerabilities of their subjects in the service of the behavioral compliance and the political loyalty that the systems required for their continued functioning. The most sophisticated forms of political control across human history have not been the forms that operated primarily through physical coercion. Physical coercion is expensive, is limited in its geographic and demographic reach, and generates the specific forms of resistance that visible oppression reliably produces. The most sophisticated and the most durable forms of political control have been the forms that operated primarily through the management of social belonging, through the construction and the maintenance of the sense in the population being controlled, that belonging to the political community, being recognized as a genuine member of the society with the full standing that membership provides, required the specific behavioral compliance that the political system required. That deviation from the required behavior was not merely a violation of political rules, but a violation of the social identity of the genuine member of the community, and that the genuine member, precisely because they genuinely valued their membership in the community, would not deviate. This is the mechanism of ideological control at its most sophisticated. Not the crude mechanism of the censor who prevents alternative ideas from being heard, though censorship has been a consistent feature of political control across human history. The more sophisticated mechanism of the political culture that constructs the social identity of the genuine member of the society in such a way that the behaviors required by the political system are experienced as expressions of the genuine member's own values, rather than as external requirements imposed on those values. The mechanism that makes compliance feel like authenticity and deviation feel like self-betrayal. Silence, in this political context, is the specific response to the mechanism of ideological control that the mechanism is least equipped to address. Not the silence of the person who has been frightened into non-expression by the threat of consequences for dissent. That silence is not silence in the sense we are describing. It is compliance through the suppression of expression, which is not the same thing as the genuine withdrawal of engagement from the framework of the control mechanism. The silence that destroys the capacity of the controlling system is the silence of the person who has developed sufficient clarity about the mechanics of the ideological control to see through the constructed social identity that the system is using to manage their behavior, and who has developed sufficient command of their own response to the evolutionary anxieties that the system is exploiting to maintain genuine disengagement from the system's requirement for their confirmation of its legitimacy. This is a demanding form of silence. It does not require the dramatic public declaration of opposition that the political system is prepared to manage. It requires something more subtle and more difficult. The withdrawal of the internal confirmation, the refusal to continue performing in the internal theater of one's own consciousness, the specific form of genuine belief in the system's legitimacy that the system requires not only from the observable behavior of its subjects, but from the quality of their actual relationship with its claims. The system's most fundamental requirement is not simply the observable compliance of its subjects' behavior. It is the genuine acceptance of the frame within which the compliance is being produced. The acceptance that the system's definition of what it means to be a genuine member of the community is accurate, that the community's values are the values that the system says they are, that the identity of the genuine member requires the behavioral compliance that the system requires. The person whose silence withdraws this internal confirmation from the system is a person in a specific and genuinely powerful relationship with the system. Not a relationship of overt opposition, which the system can process and manage through the mechanisms it has developed for managing opposition. Not a relationship of compliance, which is what the system requires. A relationship that the system's mechanics cannot fully categorize and cannot fully address, because it is neither the acceptance nor the rejection that the system's binary of legitimate member and deviant has been designed to process. Harari's analysis of the contemporary technological dimension of this dynamic is the one that makes his insights most directly and most urgently relevant to the specific conditions of the present moment. Because the contemporary technological landscape has produced, for the first time in human history, systems of social management that operate through the exploitation of evolutionary social vulnerabilities at a scale, a precision, and a sophistication that no previous system of social control has been able to approach. The attention economy, as Harari has analyzed it across his recent work, is precisely such a system. It is a system that operates through the management of social belonging and social recognition at the scale of billions of users, through the continuous delivery of the social signals, the likes, the shares, the follower counts, the engagement metrics, that the evolutionary architecture for social standing tracking registers as information about one's position in the social hierarchy. The system has learned, through the extraordinary precision of machine learning optimization applied to the behavioral data of billions of users, exactly which specific signals, delivered in which specific formats, at which specific intervals, produce the maximum activation of the evolutionary machinery for social recognition that keeps users returning to the platform. And it deploys this knowledge continuously with a precision and a comprehensiveness that no previous system of social management has been able to match in the service of the specific objective of keeping users engaged with the platform's content. The engagement it requires is the confirmation that the platform's framework is the relevant framework. That social standing, as the platform defines and measures it, is the relevant measure of social standing. That the social world constituted by the platform's social network is the relevant social world. That the signals the platform provides about one's position within that social world are significant information about one's actual social position. The person who accepts these framings is a person whose evolutionary social anxiety has been successfully recruited into the service of the platform's engagement objective, whose behavior in the specific domain of their relationship with the platform is being managed through the exploitation of the same evolved mechanisms that interpersonal and political control attempts have always exploited. The silence in this context is the specific quality of relationship with the platform's social signals that is not organized around the anxiety that the signals are designed to activate. The quality of disengagement from the specific definition of social standing that the platform's metrics measure, combined with the maintenance of a different and more grounded relationship with the actual social reality of one's actual relationships and actual community. The quality of not needing the platform's confirmation of one's social standing because the relationship with one's own actual standing in the actual social world of one's actual relationships is sufficiently grounded in genuine connection and genuine mutual recognition that the platform's metrics do not register as significant information about anything that actually matters. This quality of silence toward the platform's social signals is precisely the quality that the platform is least able to work with, because the platform's entire mechanism of user management depends on the user's anxious engagement with its signals. The user who checks their notification count with the specific quality of anxiety that the evolved architecture for social standing monitoring produces, and who experiences the number of likes on a recent post with the specific quality of social validation or social anxiety that the evolved architecture for social recognition produces, is a user whose behavior is being effectively managed by the platform's deployment of those signals. The user who checks the notification count with the same quality of disengaged interest with which they might check the weather, who experiences the number of likes on a recent post as an interesting piece of information about how the post resonated with the people who saw it, without the specific quality of social validation anxiety that the platform is designed to produce, is a user who is operating outside the specific mechanism of control that the platform's design is organized around. They have not abandoned the platform, necessarily. They may be using it for genuine purposes, genuine communication with genuine relationships, genuine distribution of genuinely valuable information. but they are using it without being used by it, without being organized by the platform's management of their social anxiety in the ways that the platform's design is organized to produce. And this is the specific quality of relationship with the platform and with the contemporary information environment more broadly that Harari's analysis of silence as the destroyer of control mechanisms points toward as the most genuinely powerful form of engagement with those mechanisms available to the individual navigating them. The deeper philosophical dimension of what Harari reveals about silence and control connects directly to his broader analysis of the nature of genuine freedom in the conditions of the contemporary world. Because the question of how to respond to the various forms of control that the contemporary social, organizational, political, and technological landscape generates is not, at its deepest level, a strategic question. It is a philosophical one. A question about the relationship between the individual consciousness and the social systems that are continuously attempting to manage it. About the nature of the freedom that is possible for a conscious being embedded in those systems, and about what the specific quality of silence that destroys the capacity of those systems to control is actually an expression of. It is an expression at the deepest level of genuine self-possession, of the specific quality of relationship with one's own experience, one's own values, and one's own assessment of one's own situation that is the prerequisite for any genuine independence from the social systems that are attempting to define all of these things for the individual in the service of their own requirements. The person who is genuinely self-possessed, who has developed a genuine relationship with their own actual values and their own actual assessment of their own situation, is a person who is not dependent on the social system's confirmation of those values and that assessment in the way that the person who has not developed this genuine self-possession is. And the person who is not dependent on the system's confirmation is a person whose behavior the system cannot manage through the mechanism of controlling the confirmation, cannot manage through the delivery or the withholding of the social signals that the system's control mechanism is organized around, cannot manage through the activation of the evolutionary anxieties about social standing and social belonging that the system's control mechanism is designed to exploit. The person whose relationship with their own actual values and their own actual assessment of their own situation is sufficiently grounded and sufficiently genuine to not require the system's validation has, in the specific mechanics of the control mechanism, stepped outside the vulnerability that the mechanism was designed to exploit. This is the ultimate significance of the silence that destroys people who try to control you. It is not primarily a tactical choice about how to respond in a specific situation. It is the expression of a specific quality of inner development, of the specific form of genuine self-possession that Harari identifies across his analysis of the mechanics of control in interpersonal, organizational, political, and technological domains as the most fundamental form of genuine freedom available to a conscious human being embedded in the social systems of the contemporary world. The development of this self-possession is not easy. It is not achieved through a single decision or a single practice or the adoption of a single philosophical framework. It is achieved, to the degree that it is achieved at all, through the patient, sustained, genuinely demanding work of developing a genuine relationship with one's own actual experience. The work of actually knowing what one values in the sense of genuine direct contact with the values rather than the performance of values that the social system requires. The work of actually knowing what one thinks in the sense of genuine direct encounter with one's own assessment rather than the adoption of the positions that the social system makes available and rewards. The work of actually knowing what one feels, in the sense of genuine attention to one's own internal states rather than the management of those states in accordance with the social system's requirements for appropriate emotional expression. This work is the work that Harari's emphasis on contemplative practice is pointing toward. The practice of actually sitting with one's own experience, directly and without mediation, long enough and honestly enough that the genuine content of that experience, the actual values, the actual assessments, the actual feelings that are there beneath the social performance and the system-produced emotional states becomes accessible as the actual basis for actual choices. The practice that develops the specific quality of inner groundedness that the genuine silence of the genuinely self-possessed person is an expression of. Because the silence that destroys the capacity of people who try to control you is not the silence of someone who has learned a technique. It is the silence of someone who does not need what the control mechanism is offering, who does not need the social standing confirmation that the interpersonal control mechanism offers and threatens to withhold, who does not need the professional recognition confirmation that the organizational control mechanism offers and threatens to withhold, who does not need the political legitimacy confirmation that the political control mechanism offers and threatens to withhold, who does not need the social relevance confirmation that the technological control mechanism of the attention economy offers and threatens to withhold, who does not need any of these confirmations, not because they have become indifferent to the genuine goods that genuine social standing and genuine professional recognition and genuine political participation and genuine social connection represent, but because their relationship with those goods is grounded in the actual reality of their actual relationships and their actual values, rather than in the system's management of the anxiety about those goods. This groundedness is what makes the silence possible. And the silence, once genuinely possible rather than merely attempted, is what makes the control impossible. Not in the sense of preventing the controlling party from continuing to attempt the control. They will continue to attempt it, they will escalate the emotional pressure, they will intensify the threat of exclusion, they will deploy the full range of mechanisms that the control attempt has available. But the effectiveness of the control mechanism depends on the availability of the evolutionary vulnerabilities that it is designed to exploit. And the person whose self-possession is genuine, whose inner groundedness is real rather than performed, whose silence is the expression of an actual relationship with their own values and their own assessment of their own situation, rather than a suppressed response to the activation of the evolutionary vulnerabilities that the control mechanism is targeting, is a person in whom those vulnerabilities are not available in the form that the control mechanism requires. This is not invulnerability. It is not the complete elimination of the evolved responses that the control mechanism is designed to trigger. The anxiety is still there, at some level. The discomfort of the social pressure is still real. The evolutionary architecture is still producing the responses it evolved to produce. But the relationship between the responses and the behavior is different. The responses are present without being determinative. The discomfort is experienced without being enacted. The evolutionary anxiety is noticed without being obeyed. And the silence that this specific quality of relationship with one's own evolved responses makes possible is the silence that the control mechanism cannot process, cannot incorporate into its logic, cannot use, redirect, or weaponize, cannot continue to sustain its functioning as a social fact in the face of. The silence, in the end, is not the absence of a response. It is the most complete response available. The response that says, with a clarity and a finality that no verbal response can match, that the frame within which the control mechanism is operating is not the relevant frame. That the definition of social standing that the control mechanism is threatening to withdraw is not the definition of social standing that is organizing the self-possessed person's behavior. That the confirmation the control mechanism requires, the confirmation that its framework is the framework within which the controlled person is locating themselves, will not be provided. Not because the self-possessed person is in a position of superior power in any conventional sense, but because they are in a position of genuine freedom. The specific, hard-won, genuinely irreplaceable freedom of a person who knows who they are well enough that the attempts of others to define them find no surface to grip. The freedom of a person who, in the deepest possible sense, does not need what the controller is offering, and whose not needing is, in the specific mechanics of the control attempt, the one thing the attempt has no response to. Harari's broader vision of what this freedom is for, beyond the immediate tactical reality of being genuinely difficult to control, is perhaps the most important dimension of his analysis. Because genuine freedom from the specific forms of control that the contemporary social, organizational, political, and technological landscape generates is not, in his framework, primarily valuable as freedom from. It is primarily valuable as freedom for. Freedom for the specific quality of genuine engagement with the actual conditions of the actual world that the person who is not organized around the anxiety about the system's confirmation of their standing is in a position to bring to their actual work, their actual relationships, and their actual contribution to the collective navigation of the present moment. The person who is not organized around the system's management of their social anxiety is a person who is, to a degree that is genuinely unusual in the contemporary environment, actually present to the actual situation they are in, actually available to the actual people they are with, actually capable of the actual thought that the actual challenges they are facing require. Because the cognitive and emotional resources that the anxiety about social standing and social belonging consistently consumes in the person whose behavior is being managed by the system's exploitation of those anxieties are available in the self-possessed person for the actual work of actual engagement with the actual requirements of the actual situation. This availability is not simply a personal benefit. It is, in the conditions of the present moment, a genuine contribution to the collective project of navigating the extraordinary challenges that those conditions are generating. The challenges that require, for their genuine navigation, exactly the quality of clear-eyed, genuinely independent, not organized by the system's management engagement that the self-possessed person, the person who has developed the specific quality of inner groundedness that genuine silence is an expression of, is in a position to bring. Because the challenges are not going to be navigated by the people who are most effectively managed by the systems that need them to remain manageable. They are going to be navigated, to whatever degree they are navigated at all, by the people who have stepped outside the system's management, who see the systems clearly rather than from within them, who bring to the engagement with the challenges the specific quality of genuine independence, genuine self-possession, and genuine freedom from the evolutionary vulnerabilities that the systems are exploiting, that the challenges actually require. The silence that destroys people who try to control you is, in this light, not merely a personal power, it is a civilizational one. The silence that says, to the systems of control that are most invested in the continued management of the people they most need to remain manageable, that the management has failed.